Well, Jason, it's great to have you on the podcast slash video here on the Tattoo Historian channel. I am so excited to talk with you about your work, Dwight Eisenhower and the Holocaust. Welcome in, my friend.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's awesome to be here, and I'm so glad that you reached out on Twitter. I still call it Twitter.
I do too.
Because I posted I posted something for people to post their books, and I said, if you have a book out there, please throw that here in the comment section. And that's how I got introduced to you and your book. And I was like, I definitely have to read this book. So thank you to De Gruyter for getting me a copy of it. Jason, I have to ask right off the top, what was it about this topic that really got you interested in writing about it?
So several years ago now, I should start this way. At Butler, we are very fortunate that we have an undergraduate research fellowship that allows undergrads to look at the Holocaust. And one of my former students asked me to be his nominator and sort of advisor for that process. You have to do a presentation. Ideally, it would end up as your undergraduate thesis. And Isaac was the student's name. He wanted to look at Schindler's List and the impact on Schindler's List. And so he won the award that year and was using the money to go to Auschwitz and do the Schindler tour. Mm-hmm. He had also identified some materials at the US Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C., and knew that he couldn't do both. Mm-hmm. And I happened to be going out to D.C. for another reason, and I said, I will swing by and, I'll pull the materials for you. And when I did that, and then I went on the tour. And when you get off the elevator and start going through the permanent exhibit, you are met with this quote from Dwight Eisenhower about his reaction to visiting Ohrdruf. And that quote stuck with me the entire time I was in the museum. It bothered me because I knew I had heard or read the quote before, but it bothered me that I didn't think anyone had really talked about it. Mm-hmm. And the more I thought about it, the more it bothered me that here is a man who everybody knew, a man who goes on to not just win the war from an American perspective, but then goes on to become president of the United States. Obviously, encountering one of these concentration camps deeply impacted him. And so I wanted to know more. And when I got back from DC, I, searched my World War II books, and sure enough, there's a quote or a portion of the quote. Look at my Eisenhower biographies. Sometimes it was mentioned, sometimes it wasn't. And I believed there was a gap. And so I started digging.
Were you ever worried about that gap, Jason, that maybe there wouldn't be as much material out there for a book length piece as maybe you would have hoped?
So that for sure was in the back of my mind. Why is it that no one else had touched this before? Right. And the more I worked, initially that was just going to be my starting point. I thought, maybe I'll do something on camp liberation and the American experience. And I found that some people had done that. I mean, there's more work to be done. There's always more work to be done. But I kept coming back to Eisenhower, and that's when I started to make the, I think, intellectual journey of realizing that while there is for sure a Holocaust literature and there is a World War II literature, and then you can get a sort of subset of Eisenhower biographical presidential literature in there too. Those streams of historical work often don't intersect the way you might think they should or would. And so the more I thought about it, the more I believed that there was, in addition to just a story, that there were connections between those streams of the historical literature that should be bridged and should be brought together, because when you bring them together, it tells a very compelling story. It's not quite a micro history, but in a way it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was really fascinated that this topic hadn't been touched before, and I was like, "Wow, okay, Jason got the lead on this one," because I've read much about Ike and excuse me, the war, obviously, and camp liberations and stuff, but the two had never come together in this way, and I was really so thrilled to see the book pop up in my Twitter feed because I'm like, that's right, I've never seen this before, so that's fantastic. Uh, where did you get your research from? What was your research, capabilities like, and the facilities you went to, and where'd you pull things from?
So the US Holocaust Memorial Museum is a fantastic museum, but it is also a fantastic depository of for historical research. And I can't say enough great things about that staff that
Mhm.
was there. I'm sure the staff that's there now is just as great, but of course, there's been some turnover since I started this project.
Mm.
The other main area was the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum, both of which facilitated requests, especially in the case of the Eisenhower Presidential Library. They just sent me everything they had. There was I would describe that as it was a wonderful package to get in the mail because I had asked and then I received. Let's put it that way.
Mm.
Um,
Mhm.
the Eisenhower papers are also full of things that he discusses that tell or complement the story in a lot of ways, and thankfully we have those here on campus, the bound editions. And so those I would say are probably the big three. Then of course there's just the scholarly literature. There's just so much on the Holocaust, on um, Eisenhower, on the war. Uh, Again, it's not picking and choosing. It's just bringing these things together so that we're looking at it through sort of a fresh light, a fresh lens. And the other thing I would say that really impacted this work in various ways was we started here at Butler. I was one of the originators of a study abroad trip to Germany, and we've always been based. Have gone to other places as well, but we always go to Berlin. And so being able to have access to, in our free time, while students might be going and enjoying other parts of the city, I was hitting archives and museums. And so the just the amount of and the sheer number of things that are there, um, not just in Germany, but here in the US. It was, I won't say that they were just waiting to be pulled together, but in some ways they were sitting there, just
Mhm.
waiting for somebody to look at them in the right way,
Mhm.
to tell this story.
Yeah. Jason, what was Ike's early military career like? How did he face challenges at that time?
So his career is, I think he would say, for a big chunk of it, was somewhat disappointing. He graduates from West Point, good. He graduates in the midst of the First World War. He's expecting that he's going to be able to go to Europe and have a command of some kind, and instead he discovers that his superiors believe him to be a superior training officer. So he never makes it to Europe. He talks at length and in multiple letters at the time, and then later in his memoirs about how he thought he missed out. Here's the war, quite literally, billed as the war to end all wars, and he stayed at home. Um, at the same time, he is really good at what he does. Not just the training aspect, but making things happen. The sort of behind the scenes, we might refer to him as an excellent paper pusher in some respects. He knows how to work within various lines of authority really well, and he catches the eye of superior officers. So Fox Connor, for example, who I think is sometimes referred to as the brains of Pershing's American Expeditionary Force, Connor identifies Eisenhower, kind of helps get him into various graduate level programs. Eisenhower faces some adversity during his time with Connor, though. He's deployed to the Philippines, and his one of his children dies, which is a crushing personal blow to him and Maine. But he continues to sort of catch those superior officers' eyes and sort of rises up through the ranks that way, until finally he's working. I mean, he works for General Pershing. He is on the battlefront or the Battle Monuments Commission and helping to write really a history of World War One. He gets to do a cross country caravan of moving equipment from Maryland to California. So he literally sees the country and how horrible our roads are. But then eventually he's working for Douglas MacArthur, and MacArthur is sort of chief of staff, army leadership. Will eventually take a job with the Philippines, and Eisenhower goes with him.
I was really interested in how these two men would work together or not work together, because it really seemed like Ike is more soft-spoken, and he does his work and he does his job, and MacArthur is MacArthur. And I was wondering about that clash of titans, if you will, because you have people who are on two different planes of thought in some ways.
Absolutely. They work well together in a lot of respects, because MacArthur can be that sort of showy presence and sort of larger than life, the Medal of Honor winner, the son of a Medal of Honor winner kind of thing. And Eisenhower can make sure things get done properly. They do clash in the Philippines. They clash in part because the Philippines are still technically under American control. They're on a pathway to independence that will be interrupted by the Second World War. But from a military standpoint, it's really an American show. They are offered rank under the Filipino system, and for MacArthur, I don't remember what the exact title is, but it's very grandiose sounding. It's very MacArthur sounding.
Yeah.
Which he accepts. He wants Eisenhower to accept a rank offer as well, but it would actually have diminished him on the American side of things. And so Eisenhower says, no, I'm not going to do that. That causes some tension. MacArthur, being MacArthur, as you put it, also grates on the nerves of a lot of people, including the American commissioner, Paul McNutt, as well as the Filipino president. And Eisenhower smooths feathers. He is friends with both of these men. They have a regular card game they play at. McNutt's wife and Eisenhower's wife, they socialize. He has his own circle, but it does cause tension, especially when MacArthur makes, for example, he orders a military parade through Manila that angers some Filipino politicians, and Eisenhower is used as the scapegoat, even though he had said we shouldn't do this. And MacArthur, though, says, no, it was all Eisenhower. I never ordered that. He also takes some heat when he announces he wants to go back to the U.S. And this is, pre-World War II, or pre the outbreak of the war for the United States. He wants to go back. He writes about how, he wanted to be back. He'd been gone for almost a decade. It was time. And he leaves, and MacArthur is angry about that as well. And the two men really don't have a good relationship after that. I got asked the other day, in fact, what would have happened if at the end of World War II Eisenhower had been sent to the Pacific, and what that reaction would have been from MacArthur. And I said, I'm not sure. I just know that MacArthur never really reconciled the fact that his former clerk then went on to become president of the United States either.
Yeah, I can't imagine what was going through his head when that would happen. I also thought, what if Ike would have stayed, and then would MacArthur leaves at the fall of the Philippines, saying he's going to be back, and Ike would have been the kind of person been like, I'm going to stay with the troops, and
it would
then
have been a very, very interesting conversation. Would he have been the sort of token, okay, well, you'll stay behind, I'll, as MacArthur, I'll leave, you stay behind, or would he have been essentially relegated for the rest of the war, had he gone with MacArthur, then to just being MacArthur's staff officer? We likely would have never heard of Dwight Eisenhower. And then that begs, a whole other what if question of then who leads the American forces in Europe?
Right.
Right. Would it have been George Marshall, and what that would have looked like? So
yeah. Counterfactuals get us down a rabbit hole. That's a whole different podcast. I did not know that there was a way for Jewish refugees to come to that theater of the world until your book. I had not realized that, and I did not realize that Ike could have been more heavily involved in that effort. Not because he was ready to leave. That's why he wasn't heavily involved. Not because he didn't want to help. Can you explain that effort a little bit, Jason, to my listeners? Because this was news to me that I had never considered or heard from before.
Absolutely. So there's a small American Jewish population. Again, right? The United States takes control of the Philippines as a result of the Spanish-American War in 1898. So by, let's just say, 1938, we've been there for 40 years. And so there's a small number of, it's large enough to host the synagogue, a couple hundred Jewish Americans who have relocated to the Philippines. Eisenhower becomes friends with some of them. And as the persecution mounts up of Jews in Europe under the Nazis, there are a lot of Jews who are looking to get out. And the major problem with coming to the United States is that the U.S. has a quota system that dates to the 1920s for immigration. It leaves no room for sort of religious or minority persecution. It is strictly based off of number of people from any given country. There are additional rules that are put in place because of the Great Depression. Refugees or people seeking refugee status have to be able to prove that they can have an income or they have money. Of course, the Nazis make sure that you're not allowed to take any wealth with you, so you're automatically sort of falling into that pauper status. It's just incredibly complex. But the Philippines, despite the fact that it is technically under U.S. protection, is on this pathway to citizenship or pathway to independence. And President Corazon has a lot of leeway in terms of how many people he allows in to the Philippines. And so Eisenhower is tangential at first to these talks, but there is a plan put together by the Philippine government, approved by the American High Commissioner, Paul McNutt, and that Eisenhower sort of gets looped into, in which they will bring in, they're planning to bring in 10,000 refugees a year for 10 years for a total of 100,000 people. That doesn't sound like a lot, but you're also talking about bringing people literally halfway around the world. And they get it started. Unfortunately, the war intervenes, and really it never gets super far, but the plan is in place. Eisenhower is a part of the sort of, not the initial planning, but the early stages of the planning. And in fact, he's asked at one point by some of his friends if he would, instead of going back to the U.S., if he would basically become their agent. And they've put up money that is more than he was making as a colonel in the U.S. Army at the time. That would have been a very, as he put it, a very, it's a very lucrative offer to go, and he would have traveled Europe and helped bring people, basically recruit them to come to the Philippines. But ultimately, he feels his calling is to stay in the Army, and so that's what he does.
Everything changed, obviously, when he leaves the Philippines, comes back to the United States, and then war breaks out. And we won't go into how he becomes Supreme Allied Commander, because that's a whole other podcast as well. We want to get focused on what he sees when he gets to the mainland. But before all these camps are liberated, even before the Great Crusade starts, what is his mindset as far as who the enemy is and what and what the U.S. and their allies are fighting against?
So he, if you spend much time studying Eisenhower, you quickly come to the conclusion that he really does see things in sports terms. He's very competitive. He played football. He was a star at West Point before his injury kind of sidelined him, and he became a coach, and he was very sort of, he understood as, my team versus their team. And obviously, as well as a patriotic American, he views, once the U.S. goes to war, he views as not just us versus them, but the U.S. is the good guys. Nazi Germany, they're our opponents. They're the bad guys. He'd had some inkling as to what the Nazis were about. There's a famous run-in with some Germans in the Philippines before his departure. But his orders are to win the war, basically. I mean, if you want to boil down what is his job, what is he told to do? It's to win the war. And so it's very much an us versus them. He's also navigating in many ways unprecedented waters for an American general. He is expected to not just sort of, lead the troops in that sort of sense, but he's got to be a full-time diplomat with our allies. We're fighting alongside the British, but we're not really fighting alongside the British. There's the major difference between the First and Second World Wars in terms of the special relationship is that there's no doubt that the U.S. is calling the shots in the Second World War. Mm-hmm. And the British are navigating that sort of landscape of we've got the Supreme Allied Commander as an American. So he's dealing with that. He's dealing with Washington, D.C. He's dealing with all the problems associated with having a president, but also a State Department, and also every other department wanting or making demands or offering opinions on things. Yeah. And then he's got to fight a war on top of that, which, with American entry going into North Africa, means that you've got to navigate the very complex nature of Germany having not technically control over Vichy France, and that the Vichy French government technically has control over France's North African colonies. But you're also having to navigate various elements of the French resistance movements, Charles de Gaulle's Free French movement, but there are other competitors for that sort of title of leader of the anti-Nazi French. And Eisenhower's got to navigate all of that as well. So his opinion, especially say 42, 43, is Germany is our main adversary. They're our opponent. I think by the time you get to the Great Crusade, by the time you get to D-Day and Overlord, it's starting to sharpen. He's got more experience, firsthand experience, to borrow a phrase maybe we'll talk about later, with the Germans, and it's starting to become less of a us versus them, as they have to be defeated, not just beaten but defeated.
I've often wondered that in the early days of the war for the United States, when they're going into North Africa and Ike takes over, and where did he see them almost as we saw the Germans in the First World War, where they need to be defeated, but not, like totally unconditionally defeated yet? Or is it something that comes about later? Obviously the things we're going to talk about, but in those early days, is it almost like the First World War all over again, hence World War II, but just like a 2.0 of 1918, where they're just like, okay, here we go again, but they're not seeing the totality of what is actually behind this effort from the German side.
I think there's 100% something to what you just said, that there is this, we're in repeat mode, or we're going to, obviously we didn't make our point the first time, so here we come again, kind of thing. I think though there's a growing awareness, and maybe Eisenhower again has a taste of this, but it's hard for us, I think, to understand that just how little we actually knew, we as the United States. So we know a lot about what Nazi Germany is doing. It's in the newspapers, for crying out loud, that they're constructing these camps back in the early 30s. But putting those things together, and really sitting down and saying, well, my goodness, this Adolf Hitler guy wrote a whole book, and he seems to be following this Mein Kampf thing. Maybe he actually meant what he said when he talked about how Jews needed to be eliminated or whatever. That's not, Eisenhower's not doing that. No one really is. But I think there's always a little bit of an edge. You do see early on Eisenhower sort of feeling as though these, his German opposites are just that. They're his opposites. They're on the wrong side. They're the bad guys, but they're generals, they're officers. I'm a general. I've got officers. But the longer the war goes on, I think the less sure anyone is that that's, except for maybe George Patton, that that's actually the case. That there's something else lurking. And you definitely get it by the end, where Eisenhower doesn't want anything to do with the surrender ceremonies, because he doesn't want to be in the same room as these people who he is confident knew what he saw at the camps were actually going on.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Those increments of getting to that point, from June 6th, and the feelings of Ike on June 6th, perhaps, or June 4th or 5th, to the Ike of May of 45. It seems like there's a different feel in the room, if you will, when you go into his headquarters. After D-Day and after the push, and we start to see things crumble for Nazi Germany, what is still known or unknown at that time, right up until the point Ike goes to see what is going on at the camp?
So I'd say there are two things. One is there's a general feeling, especially sort of by the spring, early spring, March, about this time of year. Well, a little earlier than this time of year when we're talking today, but by late February, early March, there's a feeling on the Allied side in the West that they've got the momentum, that this thing's going to be over very quickly. Part of that has to do with Eisenhower's broad front strategy, that they're just going to push and pummel and destroy the Germans everywhere. Part of it has to do with the fact that the Soviets in the East are doing the exact same thing. And then you throw in the air war over Germany. And as I described it in class just the other day, it's not that Germany's being squeezed like a vice. They are, but they're also, it's three-dimensional. They're getting hit from above too, and so it's this, as Eisenhower's grandson David wrote. There's this feeling that there's going to be a glorious finish. That's one part of it. The other part is that there is increasing, and it's laying there, and it's one of those things that American intelligence officers will talk about after the war, in their memoirs, that they can't believe they weren't connecting the dots. But there's more and more information coming in. I mean, again, we had known, at least tangentially in newspaper accounts, really by 34, 35, that the Germans were building a system of camps. We knew that they were sending people to those camps. But this is a blurb. This is a little story, right, that would appear in American newspapers. By the time the war starts in Europe, you've got the governments in exile reporting about what's happening in their countries, and that the Germans seem, the Polish government in exile, for example, reports the Germans are rounding up Jews. And so that information is getting back to Washington and London, and but the general consensus that forms is that, well, that might be happening, but we can't be sure. This is a government in exile. This could just be propaganda. We're already at war. And even once the sort of more and more information comes out, right, the idea is that the best way to end the killings in the camps, if they're happening, is to win the war. If you defeat Nazi Germany, this goes away. And there's no way you can argue against that. It's absolutely true. If the enemy is knocked out, they're going to stop doing bad things. But, and this is a big but, how much of that new information that's making it, say, to Franklin Roosevelt's desk is getting to Eisenhower? Not a lot. You might ask, well, how could they not know? What are they supposed to be doing, right? They're tasked with winning the war. What does going into these camps, whatever those camps are, how does that help us win the war? Well, it's not defeating an army. So already the intelligence, it keeps going down the pecking order of the intelligence branch. You've also got multiple agencies conducting intelligence reports, and those are getting collated, and somebody, usually back in Washington, is putting them together and then sending it to Eisenhower and his office. How much he knows, how much he's stopping to think, is probably not much at all. But as I said, after they discover the camp at Ohrdruf, and Ohrdruf is discovered in early April of 1945, and within weeks we're encountering camp after camp after camp after camp. Intelligence officers are going to look back on this, and I've read numerous accounts where they say, how did we miss this? And the answer, and Eisenhower echoes this, is they weren't looking for it. They knew the Germans had camps. They knew that they were probably labor camps, or at least some of them were labor camps, so they were related to German industry. But again, that's not a top priority when you're trying to sweep into a country and defeat its army.
What was Ike's first experience with Ohrdruf?
It starts off as a very fun day, April 12th, 1945. Eisenhower is visiting George Patton. General Omar Bradley is with them. They are visiting the Merkers salt mine, which has just been captured by American forces, and discovered that the Nazis have been hoarding loot and gold and paintings and valuable artwork in it. And they have a fun time going down and seeing all these treasures. They make, a joke like, what would happen if this rickety elevator broke? It would wipe out the American high command. Ha ha ha. Patton talks about maybe some of this gold doesn't make it into the official count, and then we'll all retire together. Ha ha ha. And then almost offhandedly, somebody suggests that perhaps General Eisenhower would like to go and visit this camp that some of Patton's men had uncovered a week before. And Eisenhower agrees. They go to Ohrdruf, and he is instantly pulled into the drama that this camp shows. The emaciated skeletons of the dead, but also the emaciated bodies of the living, who are being cared for now, but the death is still constant. The fact that you can walk into buildings and see stacks of dead people that hadn't been cremated or incinerated yet. The fact that there's a field that they go and visit. And I guess I should also preface this by saying that Ohrdruf is a sub camp of Buchenwald. It's a small camp, but it is the first camp that the Americans liberate. And there's a field outside in which the Germans had just sort of dug shallow pits and thrown bodies into it and barely covered them back up. I mean, they were trying to hide evidence as much as they could in the waning days of the war. Eisenhower walks around the camp. There's a sort of an impromptu tour. One of the former prisoners, who later, as it turns out, was not a former prisoner at all. But well, we'll maybe talk about that. But they get a tour. Eisenhower asks, his official interpreter isn't there, so one of the American GIs is sort of pressed into service, and the GI tells Eisenhower, he says, my German's not that good. And Eisenhower says, don't worry, mine is, but I have to have a minute to process what I'm seeing before I say anything. And they go around the camp. They're there for several hours. Eisenhower's aides want him to leave, and Eisenhower tells them to stop it. No, he says, I have to get this. And what he meant was he needed to see every nook and cranny. He needed to see all those bodies. He needed to see the instruments of torture. He had to understand what his men had just encountered. And that really changes things that April 12th day, because after that, as he tells the men, and he'll say this repeatedly afterwards, the American soldier is sometimes confused as to, or doesn't know what we're fighting for. Well, now they know what they're fighting against. And that's going to lead to a slew of orders and requests. He's going to order, as more and more of these camps are uncovered, all American soldiers are supposed to divert, as long as it doesn't take away from the war effort, the momentum that they've got going. They are to divert and to visit the camps for themselves, to see for themselves what they're fighting against. He's going to request from George Marshall that an official delegation be sent from Congress. He does not want anyone to claim that this is propaganda or is made up. And quite frankly, every day that passes, more and more evidence is just uncovered. More camps are liberated. He's also going to order that evidence be preserved, because he has already been, by this time, convinced that there needs to be war trials of some kind. And suddenly the people who are in charge of these camps go just about as close to the top as you can get.
Yeah, he goes on basically a media blitz, right? He's calling in press from all over the place. We know the stories about them bringing in people, German civilians, to clean up, to not only show them what was going on, but to also say, hey, you had to have known about this. But the media blitz was really important for me to look at, because I'm into mediatization of memory. And so going back to that point of, he wants everyone to see this and he wants this to be known, so you can't say it didn't happen. I thought that media blitz move on his part was just a stroke of genius. Instead of just saying, okay, at least the soldiers know, he wanted everybody to know.
He wants everybody to know, and he doesn't want anybody to forget. I think, we can look back at the Second World War and understand where Eisenhower's coming from in terms of propaganda is a P word. It's not a word you're supposed to use. That's something that's bad. It's something that Americans believe they had been duped during the First World War by British propaganda into believing that the Germans were, raping Belgium and doing horrible things to orphans and all that. And then those stories turned out to not be true. So that's Eisenhower's mindset. And he knows that if he just, releases some sort of statement that, hey, I encountered this camp and some bad things happened here, it could very easily just fall under that. So he wants the documentation. It's also radically different than what the Soviets do. And we shouldn't forget that the Soviets actually encountered the death camps, the sort of the kill centers of the Holocaust. First, they also are liberating camps, but those stories which break earlier, Auschwitz is liberated in January of 45. Those don't really percolate into the sort of Western media. Even though you've got some American and British reporters who are attached to the Red Army who file reports, their editors often kill the stories because they say this can't be true, or this smacks of Soviet propaganda. We know how horrible the war has been over there, and this no. And it also runs into the Soviets' own decision. This comes from Stalin on down, that no one suffered more than the Soviets suffered. So the Soviet civilian who is killed by the Germans during the Great Patriotic War, their suffering is way up here, and anybody in a camp who may or may not be a Soviet citizen is down here, and it doesn't matter if they're Jewish or not. The Soviet ideal. Eisenhower doesn't care for any of that. This is a horrible, inhumane thing that has happened and is apparently part and parcel to what the Nazis were all about. And so forcing Germans to go and visit the camps, documenting the camps, preserving evidence. There's a video or a movie that's made that Eisenhower has the Signal Corps go in and film camps and survivors. That's put together, and it's sent home, but it's also sent German civilians who aren't maybe living near camps are forced to go into cinemas and movie houses to watch this. And it very quickly leads to Eisenhower and a lot of the men around him to argue that there is no way the Germans didn't know. Or as the mayor of the town near Ohrdruf put it in his suicide note, we knew, but we didn't know. And for the Americans, what that translated into was you didn't want to know. You wanted the labor that came with having a camp nearby. You wanted the money that flowed from the German government. You didn't want to know what was happening to those people. You opted not to know, and you opted not to do anything about it.
Yeah. How did the Allied soldiers, how did it change the war for them? Just the common soldier and in the papers that you've seen and such, did that make the war almost like a total war now, where you're just going to, destroy the enemy no matter what because of what you had just witnessed at Ohrdruf and other places?
There's no doubt that there is that intensity for soldiers who visit. There's also no doubt that it is a scarring moment. I mean, these are by and large. I mean, of course, you're going to have replacements. You're going to have fresh soldiers who just arrived in the lines who are going to be part of liberation or care post liberation. But by and large, these are some battle hardened guys. I mean, they've seen fighting. They've had friends die. They've been wounded. I mean, war isn't new to them. War isn't new to the American army by the spring of 1945, but the camps are. And when you read the letters of the sort of common GI, they echo the kinds of things that Eisenhower is going through, this disbelief, this not just disbelief at what they saw in terms of, how is this person who I can almost, if the light hits them right, you can see their organs, it seems like they're that emaciated. Why? And how do you reconcile that with Germany, which for a lot of Americans is, they're German Americans. They've got, if not relatives, their relatives came from Germany. How do you reconcile this place that seems to to be so very similar to the United States doing this to people. There's a lot of wrestling with that. There's a lot of what we would recognize now, I think, as for some veterans of this is more, this contributes more to post-traumatic stress disorder, what we would label as PTSD, than the fighting itself did. That seeing these things and trying to reconcile what you've seen is just a lot, and not everybody. You'll read these accounts from time to time, especially children of the liberators, who say, you know, my dad never talked about this. He would talk about the war sort of in general terms, but he never talked about being, you know, a part of this liberation. And it's only after maybe a father dies, or the child has gone off to school and learned that this unit liberated this camp. And wait a minute, my dad was in that unit. Did you? And well, yeah, that those stories start to emerge. It's harrowing, to say the least.
Yeah, you stated that Ike didn't even want to be in the room with these Germans who were surrendering when it was all over in 45. What was the post-war Germany like for Ike?
So he is notified that he will be the military governor in the immediate aftermath of the war, the American zone of occupation. And so that means a couple of things. One is he's going to be responsible for all the Germans, what we label now as displaced persons, the people who were in the camps, as well as his own forces, as well as there are going to be several million Germans who are expelled from various territories, who are going to come flooding back into Germany proper. All these people he's got to take care of, and winter is sitting out there. It's coming. Germany itself is destroyed, not just from the land battles that Eisenhower had sort of technically oversaw on the Western Front, but also from virtually every major city is bombed into ruins, or huge sections of them are in rubble from the air war. So he's got a sort of a logistical and just a practical issues that he's got to deal with right away. Mm-hmm. On top of that, the Potsdam Conference is going to be held in the summer of 1945, just about a month and a half or so after the end of the war. And so he's got to help coordinate that and the arrival of a brand new president, Harry Truman, who, I didn't mention this earlier, but Eisenhower visits Ohrdruf on April 12th and learns on April 13th that Franklin Roosevelt had died. And so this is a whole other issue when it comes to that press offensive. Is Eisenhower's asking for politicians to come in the middle of an official national mourning period and a new president coming, and they're still fighting a war. But he's got to help coordinate the American delegation at Potsdam. They've also got to set up how, it's one thing to fairly easily divide the country of Germany, but Berlin is also going to be divided, and they've got to work that out. And on top of that, maybe he is also going to help spearhead the American effort when it comes to setting up this international war tribunal of Germans that we know as the Nuremberg Trials. And one of the reasons we know them as the Nuremberg Trials is because Eisenhower fights to have the trials take place in the American sector. The initial thought and what the Soviets wanted was for the trials to be held in Berlin. And Eisenhower says no for two reasons. The first is because of what happened to Berlin. It's just the infrastructure just simply is not there, and it's not going to be there. The second reason is because although he had attempted throughout the war, and it did have a good relationship with some Soviet officers, the setting up the Potsdam meeting had really soured him in a lot of ways on working with the Soviets. not to the point where he was hostile, but just that their demands don't meet with what he needs or what the American expectations are. And so he wants to control the trials, or he wants the American sector to be where they're located. So he's got a lot going on. He also agrees to stay on until those things are set up, right? And including, I should mention this, he's spearheading the denazification effort. And so whatever success we have in denazifying Germany on the American side of things, it's largely Eisenhower's, to Eisenhower's credit. But he leaves in November. He says he's going to go home and go fishing, and of course that doesn't happen.
Yeah, how does this all come home literally for him? How does this come back with him to the United States and stick with him throughout his later years into his presidency and later years? Is there always that kind of post-traumatic stress, as we would say, or just that lingering feeling of what he witnessed, and that allows him to think of freedom differently or oppression differently, because now you're fighting a Cold War?
So yes to all those things. He is convinced already, and I say already because of how the Second World War is going to end in the Pacific. He's convinced even before the nuclear bombs are dropped on Japan at Hiroshima and Nagasaki that this kind of war cannot happen again. So part of that conviction comes from his experience with sort of helping to uncover the concentration camps and the Holocaust, as we would call it now today. That can't be allowed to happen again. This kind of level of destruction is just not good. Death, the destruction of people, property, none of that is good. But also that we can't allow something like the Nazis to exist. This is on them in Eisenhower's view. And the degree that it's on anybody else, it's on them because we didn't stop them earlier, that it took this kind of war to end them. And so he is very quickly going to come to the sort of Cold War mindset that the Soviet Union is just like the Nazis. Their ideology might be different on paper, but they are at their heart and soul a totalitarian state, and they're doing the exact same kinds of things to people. And they've got to be stopped as well. And so he becomes an ardent Cold Warrior. And by the time he's president, he's willing to act on that, whether that's his preferred method is covert operations to kind of disrupt and to prevent communist governments and communist attempted takeovers. But there's also little doubt that he's willing to use, as one historian refers to it, as his bluff. He's willing to bluff that he'll use nuclear weapons if the Soviets go too far, and it works during his presidency. At the same time, that's married that sort of this kind of total destruction war is married with the fact that we can't let another Holocaust happen. And so he will become, by his own admittance, he probably wouldn't have recognized the state of Israel as quickly as Truman did. But once it's established, there's no doubt that it's over the course of his presidency, he sees Israel more and more as America's chief friend in the Middle East. They're a democracy. They're survivors of the Holocaust, and as a Jewish state, they have to be preserved.
Well, Jason, it's a fascinating book. I really enjoyed it, and I'm so glad to see these two things being linked finally, that many of us have been studying differently, separately for so long. And it was just a compelling read, because it's like, I can't believe I've waited this long to find this this book, because for years we've been reading about Ike, and for years we've been reading about the Holocaust, and to see those two subjects coming together in such a great way is fantastic. And congratulations to you on producing such a fantastic work, and to De Gruyter for publishing it. it really opened my eyes, and I know that a couple of my friends are already to take it from me and borrow it. And I'll probably never see it again, but I'm gonna demand they give it back because I made notes. So, but thank you for this wonderful chat, Jason. I really appreciate your time and the opportunity to chat with you about this.
Well, thank you, John. It's been a pleasure.